Hello everyone, so this is going to be kind of a quick tip and I'm going to show you how to make this. And what you see here is a 3D scan of a skull that we did, and on it we projected some curl noise, and I'm going to show you how to do that. So let's talk about curl noise first. And in order to find out what a curl noise is, we need to find out what curl actually is. The way I can think about curl is, imagine a water surface, just flowing water. And imagine that surface just being divided into really small cells. So that's what I've drawn up here, just like water flowing in a grid of 9 by 9 squares here. And what we're going to do next is we will drop a ball down here, like that. And we will have a stick poking through that ball, so it can rotate. And when we look at those arrows here showing us which way the water flows in each cell, we can imagine that this ball that we've dropped down here and fixed here rotates in that direction. And we can actually calculate that, and that is called the curl function. So a curl function looks at adjacent cells and calculates how a given cell would rotate, how the contents of a given cell would rotate. And that's all a curl function does. So a curl noise is the curl function of a Perlin noise. So Perlin noise is this, you know that from any image editing program. It was invented in the 80s by a guy called Ken Perlin, who, by the way, is one of the most sympathetic and most empathetic speakers I've ever seen, so really great. And curl noise, on the one hand, can generate these bright and dark values in an image. However, it can also be used to generate directions, so vectors pointing in different directions. And that's what a Perlin vector noise field is. So basically a field of many vectors pointing in different directions. And what a curl noise field is just for each cell of that field, calculated how the cell would rotate, how the contents of that cell would rotate. That is a curl noise field. The nice thing about a curl noise field is that it really looks like a liquid flowing or a gas flowing, so it can be used to simulate that. And another nice property of a curl noise field is that it's really fast to calculate. So it is computationally not expensive and thus is very easily to calculate. It's rather fast. So let's dive into Houdini and build this. In Houdini, as always, first thing I want to drop down is a geometry node. Inside of that, I'm going to use the best feature in Houdini, which is the test geometry called the rubber toy. Now, what I want to do on that rubber toy is scatter points on it. So I'm going to drop down a scatter sub, wire it up, highlight it, and lo and behold, I got scattered points. And what I want to do with those points is move them around in time. And moving points around in time step by step is called advection. So let me drop down a node called VDB advect points, because I want to advect points here. Also in the name VDB advect points, it hints at the fact that I need a VDB to advect those points. And the VDB tells this sub in which direction and with which velocity to advect the points. So let me wire up those points in here. And the velocity VDB needs to go in here. So let's generate that velocity VDB. And it's within that VDB where all the curl noise magic is going to happen. Let's create a VDB out of that geometry that we dropped down here with a VDB from polygon node. Highlight it, and I have a really coarse volume here. For this use case, a coarse volume is absolutely fine, and it's actually going to yield better or visually more pleasing results. So I've tried this before, and a value of 0.05 works great with this kind of geometry. But it's always a bit of a trial and error, so that depends on your geometry that you input there. So you gotta experiment with that size. And what I'd like to do as well is drop down an input null, so I only have to wire up one slot in here. So this is where my input geo goes. Let's call that in. However, what I want to generate is not a VDB that describes where the surface of that object is, but I want one where velocities are stored into the voxels. And I'm going to build that volume by dropping down a VDB node, just a plain VDB node. And within here, I'll have to specify the name of the volume and its class meaning which values it can store. So I'll call it vel for velocity. Fog volume is totally fine for now, and it should be of a vector float type, so that each voxel stores 3 values for our direction. So that will store our velocity vector. Size is going to be the 0.05, as we had before. And the thing about VDBs is they are sparse, which means they don't store data everywhere. They only store data where the software assumes there should be data. So in our case, it stores data only around the area of the surface, which is not what we want for a vector field, because we want to store velocity vectors everywhere. So what I need to do after I've dropped down this VDB is activate it with the VDB activate node. So that tells Houdini to regard every single voxel of that VDB and not omit any. Wire that up in here, highlight it, and that is kind of a small volume. So what I'd like to do is wire up our input geometry VDB in here, highlight our node and tell it to activate the VDB by a reference volume. So this is a reference volume. I'm going to pipe that in here. And now I see I have a fully activated and empty volume. Next thing I'm going to do is actually write values into those voxels. So write the velocity vectors into the individual voxels. And I'm going to do that with a volume VOP. Drop it down. And what that does is pretty much the same as a point VOP. It iterates over all the voxels and does something with each voxel. So let's dive in here. Looks pretty much the same as a point VOP, except for the fact that it has a density attribute. So usually volumes come with a density attribute predefined. Not in our case. We want to adjust the velocity attribute. In fact, we want to generate it for the first time. And for generating the velocity attribute, we'd like to use a curl function. And luckily Houdini comes with a curl noise function. So this function generates a noise, in our case a Perlin noise, and calculates the curl of that and stores that into vectors. The inputs I need to hook up is the position for each voxel, and I can also give it an SDF, so I can specify an object with an SDF and the noise automatically flows around that. And I'm going to do that with this slot and hook it up to my second input. So let me dive upwards, and into my second input I wire my geometry that it should flow around. This is this. Okay. Back into the VOP. And that is pretty much all I need to do inside the VOP. The only thing I need to do now is export the curl noise. And I'm going to do that with a node called bind export. And tell it to export it as a vector. And the parameter is called velocity, vel. Wire that up. And that should be it for that node. Now I can feed that into the VDB advect points node here. So I just generated my velocity database. That's here. Fire that up and highlight it. And we see some things happening here, but let's worry about them later. What I want now is to animate this stuff. So to actually not move the points around one time, but have them animate. Because when I hit play at the moment, they just stand still because they only get advected one step. So in order to repeat a certain operation over and over again, what we need to do is a solver. So let's drop down a solver node and just copy this advect node, dive into the solver and paste it here. And we want this node to operate on the data from the last frame. So we wire it up on the last frame, but it also needs the velocity as an input. And we're going to use the second input of the solver to wire up our velocity grid. Okay, so let's wire up the solver. Points go in the first input. The velocity volume goes into the second. Let's highlight it and hit play. And we see the points moving around. Quite erratically, but they move around at the moment. So in order to see the trails that these points actually leave behind, there's a very easy SOP in Houdini, very straightforward, called trail. Wire that up. Tell the trail SOP to have a trail length of, let's say, the full animation, so 250 frames. And within here we can tell the SOP how to generate the trails. And at the moment I just want to preserve the original points and just have the trail appear this way. So just leave it at that. Highlight it and hit play. And we see we generate some trails. Okay, there are several things which we need to do in order to fix those erratic points and those points getting shot out everywhere. So the first thing is make sure that although points move away from the surface, they still have a velocity field which to react to. And the way I like to do that is go into the VDB from polygons node here. And what we see here in this brownish color is its bounding box. So that's really tightly bound to the surface. In order to increase that, the easiest thing I can do is increase the exterior band. So that counts how many voxels outside of the surface still exist, and in our case it's only 3. So let's just increase it to, say, 24. And we see the bounding box increased by a lot. So now we provided the whole thing with a padding. So when points move away from the surface, they still have some vector field to react to. So let's reset that thing, highlight our trail sub again, and see what we have now. A little bit better. One thing I'd like to do just to clean up things, just to be sure, is go in here and say fill interior, so the whole interior side of the geometry away from the surface gets filled as well. Hit play again, but that didn't change much. So what's happening here? Within our volume VOP, I gave the curl noise this SDF to react to. And as our points get cloned directly into this SDF, the first thing the SOP tries is to push them outwards. The way I like to solve this is to actually shrink the geometry a bit, the collision geometry, so that the points don't initially stick into it. And I'm gonna do that by adding a node called reshape SDF. I'm just gonna add that here, just before the geometry goes into the volume VOP. And I'd like to, when I highlight it, you can see the difference. So it's expanding the volume at the moment, but I want to reduce it a bit, so that's called erode. So just want to switch from dilate to erode here and have a volume that's shrinked a bit now. So this is the original volume, this is my current volume. So back to the trail sub again, highlight it and see if that changed anything. A tiny bit. So let me dive into the volume up again. And the final thing that I think I need to tell my curl noise is the surface effect radius. So the radius in which my input surface, my input SDF, influences the noise flowing around it. And I'm just going to reduce that to 0.5, or maybe even further to 0.1. 0.2, let's try that. Have the trail still highlighted, hit play. It is still diverging as hell. Just give me a short time, I need to fix that and see what's going wrong here. Just give me a second. Alright, so I found out why it wasn't working, and the thing that I forgot was within the volume sub, in the curl noise, you need to dial down the amplitude, and it was set to 1. That was its previous value, and that's what caused these extreme repulsion here. So when you dial it back to, say, something like 0.1, you have a proper starting position, and when highlighting the trail sub, you can press play, and voila, you see those curl noise trails emerging. And the nice thing about this technique is curl noise isn't totally restricted to the surface, so it evolves away from it, like here, which makes it look very organic. Now, in order to render this, there's two things which I can do with it, and one is generate proper trails, because at the moment we only have those non-connected points, and it's done pretty easily. In the trail sub, you can just set it to, I think it was connect as polygons. Of course it was connect as mesh. No, it was connect as polygons. Yeah, close rows off, and you have those proper polylines. And there's several things that you can do with that now. For example, just render it like that. Just hook up a spline shader to those trails and render them as wires, or build geometry out of it, for example with a polywire. Let's decrease its radius. Maybe even a bit more. And now we have geometry wires. You increase the divisions so they look smoother. Yeah, something like that. So now we have proper geometry here. Maybe attach a normal node to fix those normals. Yeah, exactly. And now we could render it as polygonal wires. The other thing that I could do, and an effect that I really like a lot, is to convert those trails into volumes again and smooth them out a bit so they look kind of melted together. So let's try doing that. And there are several ways I could do that. First thing I'd like to try is, just delete that stuff here. First thing I'd like to try is to generate a volume directly out of the points that come out of the trail SOP. So I can select Preserve Originals here. So the thing I'd like to do is convert those points into a volume. And one way I can do that is with the VDB from Particle SOP. And what that does is it assumes that each of those points will yield a spherical area in a VDB. And its size is defined by a point attribute called p-scale. And if a SOP does not find that attribute, it just assumes an even point size, so an even particle size. So let's wire this up, highlight it, and this will, I think, give us a really big and bloaty VDB, exactly. And the reason for that is we assumed each point a scale of 1, and that's really too high. So let's dial that back to, say, 0.01. This will yield nothing, because the voxel size is too small. I mean, the voxel size is 10 times the size of one particle, so we need to dial that down. And as a general rule of thumb, what I do is I choose my voxel size to be half that of the size of the point radius. So in our case, 0.005. And that yields us this VDB. So you can see it here. What it does is really, it assumes that each point is a sphere, which for some approximations works. So let's try and smooth this out with a VDB Smooth SDF. Wire this up, highlight it. Yeah, and that gets kind of this ceramic baked / liquidy look. But if I want to decrease the particle size here to give it a bit more detail, there are some things that are gonna happen. Let's do it like that, and this should be half of that size, so let's do it like that. Exactly. So this is more like the detail which I'd like to have, but in those larger areas where we have larger steps, the points are spaced apart too far for that. So what I need to do is get back into my trail SOP here and switch that to connect as polygons with the close rows switched off. Now when I highlight the VDB from Particle SOP, we see nothing really has changed. That's because the points haven't been adjusted or haven't been moved. So there's several things I could do about that. One would be to resample this trails here, so to add additional points and space them uniformly apart. That's the first thing I'm going to do. So let me check VDB from particles. It says 0.02. Let's add a resample node before that and set the length to 0.001. Yeah, like that. Takes some time. There it is. Now have my really clear lines generated directly from those points. However, I need quite a lot of those points in order to generate a volume that does not have gaps in between. So my point count is really high here. I could try something a bit less dense, yeah, something like that. See if that works. Yeah, it's looking good. I think we can even try spacing them apart a bit more. So well, that looks about right. Okay, let's zoom out. And I think, in general, I have too many points for what I want to do, so I'll reset the simulation. Go into the Trails hub, because that converges a bit faster than the VDB from particles here. And I'll highlight my scatter. And I think I want to dial down the point count to something like 400, for example. Solve this again, simulate it. And activate the VDB from particles again. Still a bit dense in some areas, so let's try to do this with a smaller point count again. Okay, that looks about right. And what I can do now is smooth this SDF. So it melts together, that gives kind of those molten appearance. Okay, so the smoothing kind of kills all those lines, and that is because those lines are really only just 2 or 3 voxels in width, and with the smoothing algorithm it just kills them out. So if you have a very thin line and blur it too much, it is just gone at a certain point. But we can help that, so let's pull this down a bit, and in between add a reshape SDF node, and by default the reshape SDF node is set to dilate the volume by 1 voxel, so it will expand the volume by 1 voxel. So let's try and see if that already fixes it. Okay, it brought back some detail. So let's tweak this in the VDB smooth. So what I like and what I want to exaggerate a bit is the smoothing between individual trails here. So let's maybe set the smoothing algorithm to Gaussian, which is a bit more aggressive than the usual mean value that it calculates. So that killed out a bit too much of my voxels. As I said, Gaussian is really aggressive, so let's try it with 2 iterations only. Still doesn't look too convincing, so let's maybe dilate it a bit further. Okay, let's try dialing up the VDB smooth again. Still not as smooth as it could be, so let's maybe see if we can go back to 4 iterations with our slightly dilated volume, so our slightly expanded volume. Now that was a bit too aggressive, so let's stick to 3. Okay, so we have it, our smoothed curl noise lines, and what I really like about them are those areas where they melt together and then just diverge out to form individual strands again. And yeah, that is curl noise inside of Houdini. Hope you enjoyed it. And as always, if you create any artwork using this technique, please let us know. We're really excited to see what you guys come up with, and I hope you enjoyed this one. So cheers and goodbye.